Hello, everybody. My name is Thomas Fracken. This is the Roundtable Chats podcast, episode 7. My guest today is Mike Buckler. Mike is the attorney advisor for the U.S. International Trade Commission, and he's the CEO and general counsel of VillageX.org. Mike and I met at a Peace Corps event 3 years ago at GW and have been periodically in correspondence since. Mike, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. A question I always like to start with is, what are you grateful for?
I'd say, well, over the course of my life, grateful for many things, but at the moment, grateful for my family. I have a lovely wife and 2 awesome kids, and they consume most of my time and energy. But
absolutely.
I'm very grateful for that, for that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I guess I want to dive a bit into your life story. I mean, in as many or few words as you like, what is your life story? What's your background?
I think typical, in some ways, very typical suburban, kind of small town kid. My parents are both from Baltimore, and I grew up in a place called Southern Maryland, which is about an hour south of D.C. And yeah, it was mostly I would say a rural upbringing, a small town upbringing, in combination with a lot of visits to DC where my aunt lived, and then Baltimore where my grandparents lived. So I felt, I often tell people that I understand the Trump phenomenon better than most progressives do, because I grew up in Trump country, but at the same time I was exposed to a lot of other things and a lot of sort of cosmopolitan things in the cities. And then, I guess one thing that was pretty influential in my life is that, 2 things. One was I went to a Catholic high school because I grew up in a rural area, and the local high school, the public high school, sent, I think when I was of high school age, it sent like 17% of its graduating class to college. And my parents said, "You're not going to that high school." And I said, "Okay." It's kind of a bummer. All my friends are going. But so I commuted like an hour each way to go to a little Catholic high school. And I think that was the first time in my life that I really, well, not the first time, but it was a very sort of influential period of my life where I was absorbing a lot and was exposed really to sort of social justice, pro-poor social justice advocacy, because a lot of the people in my school, a lot of the teachers worked for very little money, probably $30,000 a year. Brothers taught at the school who were, basically just the Catholic Church was paying for them to eke out an existence, and they were highly educated people who just wanted to support our educational development. And so it was it was conservative religiously,
right? But
in many ways it was very progressive in terms of social policy, other than the obvious issues like abortion and that sort of thing,
right?
But very pro-poor social policy. And so that sort of I think got me started more on a service track that I might not have been on otherwise. And then, college, electrical engineering, but didn't really want to be an engineer, which was kind of stupid. But then
I was going to say, how would that happen? Yeah.
Given the rise of the internet, when I was in college, we got email for the first time. And
what year was this when you first got email?
So I remember, I guess maybe I was an entering freshman in 92. Okay. Email was just still very young, and everyone had an account. We used it some of the time. But I grew up in elementary school with the old Apples and programming them to make the turtles move across the screen.
Right.
So it was definitely, I knew it was coming. I didn't realize Silicon Valley was going to blow up the way it did. Sure. Otherwise, I may have gone out there after college, like some of my friends did. But I took a year off and I went to law school. And I went to law school in large part because I thought lawyers were the ones that actually changed things and made the world better. And that if you really wanted to focus on social justice issues, you needed to have a legal background.
Right.
And so I went to law school thinking that I was going to be like a public interest lawyer. And then with my engineering background, I ended up getting into intellectual property law and in particular patent litigation. So I practiced, I worked for a couple of judges, clerked, and then I went into a patent litigation firm and litigated for about 4 years mostly for Microsoft and some other companies. And kind of, that was sort of a wake up call about how the world really works. And then I decided after 4 years of that, I was pretty exhausted, and I'd always wanted to be in the Peace Corps. So I just quit my job and applied to the Peace Corps. Well, applied to the Peace Corps, got accepted, quit my job, and then hopped on a plane and went to Malawi for 2 years. And that was 06 to 08. Okay. And I've been working in Malawi ever since. So it's been about 10 years post Peace Corps working in some capacity with extreme poverty in Malawi.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to ask is why Malawi? Why was that where you went? Because I know you've done so much work there.
Just random. So with my legal background, the Peace Corps wanted initially to send me to Eastern Europe to work for like pro-democracy NGOs.
Oh, okay.
And I wasn't really too excited about that option. And I wanted to try teaching. I thought maybe I would go from law into teaching eventually. I've since decided that that's not the move I want to make. But and so the Peace Corps said, if you want to teach, there's a good chance you're going to go to Africa. And with my engineering background, they wanted me to teach math. And so they called me or wrote me and said, you're going to Southern Africa and you're going to teach math. And so I did some online searching and figured out that there were 3 options. I think at that time, Mozambique, Namibia, and Malawi. And then they ended up sending me to Malawi. But it was just, now you can like apply to specific countries in the Peace when you get into the Peace Corps. But back then you basically were just like, at the mercy of the agency. And they couldn't have chosen a better country for me. It's an amazing country.
Yeah. Let's explore that a bit. I mean, when you first stepped foot in Malawi, I mean, what was your impression? What surprised you? I mean, you might have had some expectations going into it, but of course it must have been completely different.
Yeah. So the first thing, one of the greatest experiences of my life, I think, was getting off the plane and feeling like I was welcomed like a rock star, because they basically send out like a group of volunteers to cheer for you at the airport. These airports are like tiny airports. They're nothing like American airports. So you can imagine just like, one runway or 2 runway airports. And then there's no like, the plane doesn't pull right up to the building. You don't go through a tunnel. You just like step out onto the tarmac off the plane. And then in the distance, there's like a terminal, and then on the terminal, like all these volunteers cheering with like a big banner. So you kind of feel like a rock star. Yeah. And then you immediately go into 10 weeks of pretty intensive training, living in a village, studying the language, studying the culture, teaching every day. What were my impressions? It's it's called the Warm Heart of Africa. It's very friendly, incredibly hospitable. People are just super vibrant. But at the same time, you just see a lot of, right off the bat, you see a lot of things that they're sort of indelible. They stay with you for a long time, and human suffering that you don't really want to see. There's, when you live in a village, there's a lot of, in the United States, death is pretty rare. But in a village setting, people die with some frequency and unexpectedly. And there's often no information regarding how they passed away. So it's that's super strange. You see extreme inequality. I mean, we have a lot of inequality in this country, but we have at least a decent sort of social service network, or social service programs that, even though they don't always work, they're intended to help poor people. In Malawi, there's no social service program. So you're just sort of, 85% of the country lives in rural areas, and you're kind of on your own farming, your acre or half acre of land, and sort of at the whim of the weather and government policy, most of which is pretty bad. And so it's just kind of you and your community, very tight knit, very sort of erratic income flows depending on the year and the conditions. But at the same time, incredibly cohesive. And you also realize just like how strange it is. I mean, you've seen in our country, sort of the movements that have bubbled up in recent months have gained a lot of traction. In Malawi, 85% of the population is virtually powerless. They're just, living in a village. They have representatives in parliament, but they don't. The representatives come around election time and give them some money, and that's about all.
That's it.
There's very little feedback flowing from people in the villages to the people who are making policy decisions in the capital. So you see a lot of inequality, just not of wealth, but of power. And you, I think, very quickly realize that, people are that poor in our world because of conscious decisions that are made by concentrations of power. That these are not. This is not like random poverty.
Yeah.
This is very much deliberate poverty. That's caused by one group having a lot of power and money and not using it to help another group.
Yeah, no, it reminds me of a book I was just reading, Why Nations Fail, by these two development economists. I'm sure you've heard of it or read it. And just the difference between extractive institutions and inclusive institutions. And there it is. You're showing it to me now for the listeners.
If I could sleep with a book under my pillow, that might be the book.
Incredible book. Yeah, I just finished it. I loved it so much. And now I just see that paradigm everywhere: exclusive versus inclusive or extractive.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at Haiti and Dominican Republic. You can look at Mexico and the U.S. It's really interesting, and there's so much sort of history. I think a lot of it is, current institutions and political systems grow out of historical arrangements, and it takes a long time for them to change. And so, it's, what many least developed countries in the world are in Africa, and many of those countries, post, I would say, starting with the colonial period, and highly, extractive and somewhat centralized institutions. And basically, after independence, you had elites come in, African elites, with a lot of money from the West that has been flowing now for like 50, 60 years, just sort of perpetuating the institutions that existed during colonialism.
Right.
And so, and of course, the European powers, the United States, set. It's not just the political institutions; it's also the inertia caused by the economic institutions. So, if you look at Malawi, for example, they're exporting exactly the same thing they were during the colonial period.
Right. Yeah, it hasn't changed.
Very little change in the economy, because those things are hard. Powerful people, have control over the industries in Malawi that are lucrative, and until some disruptive force comes along to change that dynamic, it's very hard to modify.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think in the book, my favorite example was the South Korea versus North Korea, because South Korea was very poor in the 1930s or 1940s, and then it's had this meteoric rise. And reading the book, it made me actually really want to visit South Korea and just kind of unpack that a bit and talk to the people there. I have a friend of mine who lives in the Philippines, and that's been great talking to her and being in correspondence with her for the past 4 months or so, because just looking at that country, there's a lot of things that I take for granted. Like, she was telling me, she's like, well, once I'm working on more money, I'll start to read books like you do, Thomas. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Why don't you just go to a library? And I was so naive. There are no public libraries, and it's like, wow, that's a good way to have a great power dynamic if you don't even have libraries for the people to learn from. It's like, it's just, yeah.
Absolutely. South Korea is an interesting example. It's it basically for many years, as it began to develop, was very autocratic, and the government basically cut a deal with the economic elites of the country, and the government would enforce sort of rules of behavior very strictly. So, in order to curb corruption that the private sector would otherwise be very tempted to engage in, and so sort of this interesting. There's a great professor at Princeton, Professor Coley, and his book is, you want to read this next. It's called State-Directed Development.
States of what? Sorry, say again. All right.
It's called State-Directed Development.
Okay, State-Directed.
It's basically all about states really getting their acts together and then sort of, aligning governmental interests with private interests to develop policies that 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 lead to economic growth, and that can be somewhat, even though they might not be terribly inclusive at first, they can over time evolve into more inclusive arrangements. And so he looks at a number of countries, South Korea being one of them. He looks at Nigeria. He's from India originally, so he takes a deep look at India. But yeah, it's what a lot of people don't understand. But I mean, one of the important things is trying to figure out like why some countries can sort of make this work. How some countries can get the elites, the political elites and the economic elites, to work together for the betterment of the country, and why other countries can't. And I think with South Korea, at least, one big factor was an existential threat. And so the Chinese were a huge threat. The Japanese had colonized Korea. And so there was a real sense that if we don't get our shit together here and make this country stronger economically and geopolitically, that we're gonna lose our country. Now you can contrast that with a lot of countries in Africa where there's virtually no existential threat.
Right.
They're poor. Like Malawi doesn't worry about Zambia invading.
Yeah.
If it did, if that was really a concern, you might see more inclusive institutions or a greater effort by the elites to actually make Malawi stronger as a country and spend less time pillaging Malawi.
Yeah. No, and going back, into Malawi, what kind of, so you come there for Peace Corps, what kind of work were you doing there initially when you arrived?
So I was initially, trained to be a teacher, a math teacher, and different generations of Peace Corps volunteers had kind of different roles in Africa. Early on, a lot of Peace Corps volunteers, like in the 60s, taught at universities. And that's, I guess, what countries wanted at the time when they had, a lot of these countries were just like handed over to leaders that had oversaw countries with sort of very limited human capacity in terms of like educated, bureaucrats, professors, entrepreneurs, et cetera. And so they had very little to work with at the beginning. And I think these volunteers are brought at much higher levels, and that affects their thinking to this day. It's kind of interesting. But for my generation, all the Malawians who had any means or education were already filling those higher positions. And so we were assigned to what are called community day secondary schools, which are high schools at the village level. And that's where the government has the hardest time recruiting teachers. So now the present day Malawian Peace Corps volunteers are deeply embedded in villages, often in very rural areas, and doing the best they can to sort of scrape together teaching materials and motivation to help kids who, have limited options. The one good thing is if they're able to score well on a national examination that's given, sort of like the SAT or the ACT that's given at the end of high school, they do potentially have the opportunity to go to college, and then education is definitely a ticket to like the next level economically.
Yes. Yeah.
But very few of them get that chance, even if they do test well, which is really hard for kids who don't have consistent teaching and good materials and everything else. Then they run into the problem of having to pay for college if they can get in. So it's a pretty discouraging situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I started up doing a lot of teaching, and that's what I did throughout my tour. But I found myself also doing a lot of environmental work. So, planting trees, drying fruit, taking kids on hikes up Malanje Mountain, which is one of the tallest mountains in Africa.
Okay.
There's a lot. You feel very connected to the land when you live in a village, because it's all around you, and it's sort of the lifeblood of the community.
Yeah. And coming from the United States and going to living in a village like that, what were some of the most jarring things, or what were some things that you kind of took for granted back at home? And then,
I think this gets to one of the drivers of development, which is technological innovation. There are a lot of things around you that allow you to be more productive than you would be if you were just living outside.
Right.
You can drive your car, save energy. You have lights. You have climate control. You can just go downstairs to the refrigerator and grab some food. Basically, in Peace Corps, wow, you're camping for over 2 years. And so everything is incredibly labor intensive. You have to, fetch your own water. You've got to hand wash your clothing. You have to make a fire to cook. You have to, just everything takes forever. And then at the end of the day, you're just exhausted. So I think it's just that, I think that the most jarring thing for me was just just the amount of energy required to get through the day. And that doesn't leave a lot of time for doing other things, which is why technology has been so effective at helping to develop countries, because it can drastically improve productivity per person.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And what was your kind of day-to-day life? When would you wake up? What, just kind of take us through that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, you find these sort of get on the same cycle as the sun. So when the sun goes down, pretty much the village is quiet, and people go to sleep. And then when the sun comes up, shortly before the sun comes up, the roosters start, making noise, and everyone wakes up and gets moving. So you kind of get on that schedule. So I had a headlamp and a little solar panel to charge my batteries. So I could stay up a little bit later than most. But I probably went to bed around 9 or 9:30 every night and got up around 6 to 7 every day. You do a lot of reading. You have a lot of sort of discretionary time. I rode my bike all over the place. It's because it's just I lived in a beautiful part of the world, and there were a lot of just rural dirt roads everywhere. There were no cars. People got around on foot and bicycle primarily. And so, I would just ride from village to village and, visit little tea shops. Malawi exports a lot of tea, and the tea that sort of the dregs, the stuff that isn't exportable, goes to little village tea shops where you can go and get a cup of tea. So, just sort of ride around, talk, a lot of Malawian rural society, at least, is very collaborative and social. And so a lot of it's just maintaining relationships. And the Peace Corps volunteers that the Malawians don't like are the ones who sit in their homes and kind of don't interact with the community. They're very skeptical of those people. But if you get out and you make friends and engage in activities, then people are really very appreciative.
Yeah, and I wanted to find out more about the community there and the people and those interactions and what they were like and their personalities and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing you realize, Africa is so caricatured that you think, you oftentimes village people are presented as sort of backward and simplistic and ignorant and those sorts of things. What I found is that it's village life is just incredibly complex. Peace Corps volunteers understand some of that complexity because we can speak the language decently and we get cultural training and that sort of thing. But there's a lot we don't understand. We're never going to be native. And the more time I spend working in Malawi, the more nuance I see. And the more I appreciate that all the Malawians are very sort of gregarious on the outside and very, sort of pleasant to be around. They have a lot of stuff going on the inside that they don't necessarily share unless you're close to them. So the same stuff that we deal with. I mean, it's really just human stuff. Relationships fit. Relationship conflicts. Worries about their kids. Worries about providing for your family. Not knowing just general life uncertainties. And so there's and one thing that I'm kind of obsessed with understanding and studying is power dynamics, whether it's at the community level or the regional level or the national level, and I'm very interested in knowing and figuring out how communities share power. The stereotype has been that chiefs are sort of mini dictators, and they have their little fiefdoms and people just sort of are their subjects. And that's a very convenient narrative for the aid industry because the aid industry can come in and kind of trash chiefs and elevate their own status. But what I find is that chiefs are, it's the opposite, that people live together in these small villages and chiefs are actually are highly respected. And they have a few more resources than the rest of the people in the village. But they're living in extreme poverty like everyone else. They are held accountable by people living in the community. Chiefs are like small town mayors and judges and city councils kind of all rolled into one. So they spend a lot of their day just solving problems for people, like land disputes or marital disputes or whatever it may be. So their jobs are not particularly appealing, and they also get a really good sense of what their villages need, like where their problems are. Are they seeing a lot of under 5 deaths because of diarrheal disease? Are they, do they need clean water? Real, priority. Are they having trouble growing crops? They have agricultural issues. Do people have livestock assets? Like they kind of know where the gaps are in their communities, and far better than any outsider. So I'm very bullish on villages, and think that just like there are concentrations of power at the national level that harm development, there are concentrations of power in Washington, D.C. and London that harm development, because a lot of the money that flows through the development coffers really isn't used in any way that reflects what local people want, what their preferences are, and what they need. Instead, it tends to reflect our priorities in the West, and it tends to, in many ways, undermine democracy and undermine feedback, because it silences the voices of the poor.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious where these I guess the chiefs come from and how they're crafted and how they're chosen in society. Is it more through certain families, or is it more kind of merit based and how people nominate them? Like, where do they come from?
Yeah, I think it's it depends on the tribe. Some are patrilineal and some are matrilineal, and so chiefs are not elected typically. They just inherit their positions.
Right.
And I think that the selection process varies somewhat depending on the tribe and the village, but and in many villages, have multiple tribes within them, so like they have to work out those differences. But I don't understand all the ins and outs, but there are ways. Every village has a way of selecting chiefs when a chief passes away, and every village has a way of, in extreme circumstances, removing a chief or replacing a chief with someone else. And because everyone's living so close together, and there's chiefs are just as corruptible as anyone else, and they certainly have the same desire to hoard resources as anyone else, but they can't get away with it at the local level, because people will go to witch doctors and cast spells on them, or they'll try to hold them accountable in other ways and make it very clear to the chief that they're unhappy with the chief's behavior. So there are checks and balances, even though there aren't elections. And it's sort of one of the ironic things about Africa is that a lot of countries where elections are held, and a lot of people who sort of look at this in a very superficial way in the West sort of look at Africa and say, look, we have all these democracies that have elections, but really what most of these countries tend to be categorized as what's called competitive authoritarian, which is, you have autocrats who engage in the exercise of rigged elections in order to get some semblance, the appearance of democracy. But the actual inner workings of the country are very undemocratic. And Malawi would certainly fall into that category.
Okay. Yeah. And so you're living in Malawi. So where did Village X org come in? How did you come up with that idea? Where did that originate?
Yeah. So I was just trying to, I think I came home with PTSD. Okay. To be honest, I came home and just was really upset and confused about what I saw. I kind of was, I think I really appreciate the opportunity Peace Corps gave me to live in rural Malawi. Right. But I think like a lot of Peace Corps volunteers, I came home and I was like, well, this is it. Like, yeah, it's really nice that I got to live there, but it didn't really help the country that much. I probably know the country better than most outsiders. I speak the language better than almost all the other outsiders, many of whom don't even learn any of the local language. So I really felt like I was in a unique position to maybe do more to help Malawi, or to help rural Malawians. and I didn't know how to do it. Like I racked my brain. I got back in late 08, early 09, and then kind of racked my brain until 2014. Did a lot of research, dug into a lot of academic research on, political science, economics in Africa, aid. What is aid? Why does it function the way it does? Just trying to parse through all the confusing things I saw. As a Peace Corps volunteer, you get very close to folks in the village, but you don't really understand how everything is operating above you in the cities. So I'd go into the cities and I would see embassy officials, U.S. embassy officials or USAID people. And, I'd stay at their homes occasionally and talk to them and kind of pick their brains and try to gather as much information as possible about how things work. I like figuring out, how things work. It just took years to piece it all together and come to some sort of coherent understanding of why the basic question is Malawi gets $1 billion a year in aid, in overseas development assistance every year, $1 billion. Why are people so poor? Why does 85% of the country live in such dire poverty? And why hasn't it gotten better? Because remember, I left in late 08. Okay. I went back in 09, 2011, 2014, 2016, 2017. Right. I keep going back and I keep seeing the same thing, which is very little change. And so that was really the Village X grew out of that question. Like, what is going on here? Right. And what can we do to help fix the problem? And so Village X really was an experiment. And the experiment was, is it possible to achieve development gains in rural Malawi by partnering directly with villages? As a Peace Corps volunteer, I appreciated the ecosystem of a village and how people work together, and there's a lot of accountability. So instead of doing what some NGOs do and giving straight to individual families or individuals, what if we use the village, this capacity of the village, as our foundation? Say, what do you guys want in terms of development projects? What are you willing to invest your own money in? Which is a key question that most NGOs don't ask. We require every village to put cold, hard cash into the projects that we support. So choose a project, put your cash in, and we'll crowdfund the rest. Right. And then we're going to do a deep data dive. We're going to look at about 17 development indicators in your village over time to see in a standard statistical analysis to see what, if anything, changes and whether those changes are statistically significant. And we've had really great results. Awesome. So, and we keep seeing more and more improvements across more and more of these development metrics every year, which is super encouraging. And the growth is accelerating. It's not like flat. Yeah. So we look at things like, enrollment in school, primary through tertiary. We look at waterborne illness rates. We look at, number of cows, number of goats. We look at lifestyle indicators like number of TVs, number of motorcycles, number of homes with iron sheets or steel sheets instead of thatched roof. So and what's sort of unique about our approach, and the reason why I call it an experiment, is because many NGOs are single issue NGOs. Right. We do water, we do education, we do that. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Yeah. Because you can change one variable in a village, but it doesn't mean, so let's say you solve the water problem. Congratulations. That's great. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you've helped anything else. And you may solve the water problem and spend a bunch of money doing it. But if you don't inject more money into another area of interest to the village, another problem area, you may not get as high a return on your investment as you could, on your water investment as you could. So let's say that water leads to, much more potential productivity for people because they're healthier. Well, if you don't combine that with something else, like maybe, better schools or, financing to start businesses or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
You may not take advantage of that unleashed productivity. And so we see the villages really as ecosystems and not as single issue, beneficiaries. And we're really interested in seeing what villages choose. We're really interested in the democratic, dynamics that already exist in these villages. And then seeing not only, we try to answer three questions. What do villages want? Why do they want it? So why over time do they make certain decisions on projects? And then what's the impact per dollar spent? And the per dollar spent part is really important. There are a lot of NGOs that will say, we've got these impacts, but they won't tell you how much they spend per village.
Right.
So
yeah.
I know NGOs that can, most don't even collect, interesting data at all.
Right.
And then those that do often don't tell you the second part when they set an impact. It might cost, it might be massively expensive per village to get their impacts, which is not scalable.
Yeah, I mean, having this data and the science is so important. Recently, I read this book called The Science of Giving that was great, and it just had all these case studies and all these research papers about when trying to communicate with a donor what they say they want, but what they really react to and things like that, and just the psychology of it I find very fascinating. But also just this miscommunication. I remember quite vividly this conversation we had a while ago, but you said some Americans or someone in a first world country will send a goat and they'll feel so good about sending a goat to a village. But then meanwhile, the village is like, this isn't really what we need. Like, we'll take it, but we wish you kind of talk to us first. And it baffles me how much aid doesn't have this conversation. I mean, you would think that would be the most basic first step, is talk to the people who need help. I mean, I don't know. So that's what I've always really liked about Village X is you do have this communication. And if you do donate to a village, you get pictures and you get up-to-date feedback about where that's going. And I think that's also incredibly important.
Yeah. And it's really, I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily what moves donors to give more, but it's important to us to give you a profile where you see all your giving, and then you see the things that actually have changed in the villages that you gave to compared to a control group. Mm-hmm. And so, a lot of people will provide like before and after data,
right?
But it means nothing unless you provide some kind of credible control group,
right?
To compare against. And so, we're trying to encourage people to think about donating much more like they would about investing.
Yeah.
And that you might have, I mean, wealth is really concentrated in our country, and so there's a lot of awesome opportunity for nonprofits to encourage people who are wealthy to invest large amounts of money. But you have to show them that there's good ROI.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what we're trying to do with our data. And we're also completely comfortable if there isn't ROI, telling them there isn't ROI. You know what I mean? Like we're an experiment in the sense that we're not trying to build an NGO for our own sake. We're trying to build an NGO that works, that like actually serves the needs of people in rural Africa. There are 400 million people living in extreme poverty in rural Africa. It's the only place in the world where extreme poverty is growing. Everywhere else, it's shrinking.
Right.
So, in many ways, the last 50 years or so has been a huge success in terms of quality of life around the planet. There's far less poverty than there was before. I mean, admittedly, China is responsible for a lot of that poverty alleviation.
Sure.
But there have been some really amazing, staggering gains in how human beings live on this planet. Unfortunately for the international development industry, there's very little evidence that they were responsible for. And so we need to kind of parse out those two things. When Bill Gates says we need more aid because aid has been so successful, right. Or he might not say aid has been so successful. We just need more aid because aid works.
Right.
The implication is often that all these wonderful things that have happened in the world in terms of development are attributable to aid. But that's not, I don't think that's an intellectually honest way of looking at it. That doesn't mean that aid couldn't be very effective. I think it could be much more effective. Right. Aid, however, I've come to understand is very much a diplomatic tool. It's about, Western elites and host country elites kind of entering into what I call a devil's bargain, where the Western elites kind of build their careers and disperse aid and send their kids to college on the backs of the poor. And the local elites, the host country elites, get good lifestyles and the power that comes with aid money. And they steal a lot of it, but and very little of it actually leaves the urban areas, gets into the rural areas. But the countries remain somewhat stable. They're sort of perpetually labeled basket cases, but they're somewhat stable. And so there's this kind of like fear. There are a lot of people, I think, at the State Department, USAID, and DFID and other institutions that recognize that they're sort of in this unhealthy equilibrium where countries are not completely falling apart, but they're not really progressing very quickly. And we need solutions that address not just the development aspects, like clean water to reduce waterborne illness, but that also address the political the dynamics that lead to the current unhealthy equilibrium. So one really interesting thing about Village X, it's my belief that the U.S. should be actively working against these regimes that refuse to help their own people. Like the Malawian government's record is pretty poor. That doesn't mean that you take aid away from them completely, but if you redirect some of that aid to villages, let's say, right, especially with a model like ours where the per person cost is tiny. It's like based on what we've done so far, it's $1 per person.
Wow.
Okay, so it's tiny per year. So it's much more affordable than other development programs. And there's some interesting research from Chris Blattman at the University of Chicago that he did in Uganda, where the government transferred cash to young people in the north, kind of the war-ravaged north, for them to kind of like no strings attached. But the idea was that they would start businesses. And not only did it help them financially over time, it also led to an increase in voting for the opposition party in Uganda. So this is kind of strange because the government is giving them cash transfers. You would think that the government agreed to that because they thought it would buy them some political currency in northern Uganda. And what happened instead was it freed the people who got the money from patronage networks, and they were able to vote against the government, which of course makes sense in Uganda, where you've had a guy in power for decades and who keeps on, finding ways to stay.
Yeah, sure.
And so what I think Village X could do is just for $10 or $20 million a year, we could cover all the extreme poverty villages in Malawi. So this is just a pittance compared to the aid budget. And then hopefully free these villages from the patronage networks, and encourage their people to vote, to have a much stronger political voice. And then politics in Malawi it's a long-term project, but it's only going to happen with pressure coming from the people. It's not you're never going to change a government by pumping more aid into it.
No. No.
And so, you have to, the important thing is to conceptualize development as a series of battles and fights, and stop thinking of it as sort of a technocratic, if we can just transfer the right technology, the Jeff Sachs model of, by the way, his program was very expensive. Let's go into a village and sort of do development on steroids, where we give them a bunch of stuff and then we see what happens. But we don't address the politics. And that's a great way to waste money.
Yeah, seriously.
You have to both address the development challenges and the politics at the same time. It turns out that rural Africa is covered with democracies. They're called villages. Right. Right? So you already have just massive widespread democracy in rural Africa. You just don't have it at the regional capitals and in the national capitals. So you have to find a program that's going to do both the development side and also the political side. And I think what we do satisfies those criteria pretty well.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I feel like when people from first world countries give, yeah, they're just doing things on the development side, not the political. What more can we do with the political? That just seems a lot more challenging. But
Yeah, well, I think we have to. We've been playing this game for 50 years, where we say, we really believe in democracy. We really don't like concentrations of power. We know you're stealing money.
right,
Blah 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 blah. And then next year comes along, and the aid money flows in.
yeah,
So it takes political will on our part and political courage to say, USAID, you have a bunch of money to spend in Malawi. Congratulations. Or Millennium Challenge Corporation, you have all this money to spend. You got to actually not spend it if leaders are exhibiting anti-democratic behaviors. And no one, whether it's the UK or the US or the Nordic countries or Japan, no one has really been willing to do it, to really say to a country, look, we're done with you. And I think that, or we're putting you on hold. There was a brief period in Malawi after the 2014 Cashgate scandal where $32 million was stolen from the treasury by Malawian officials. There was a brief period where aid was cut off. And there was also a period, I think in 2011 or so, when the current president was highly critical of the West, and the West cut off some aid and caused the economy to go into a nosedive. So there have been these fleeting moments where the West has sort of stood by its principles. But
right.
I think for the most part, the West is sort of caught in this catch-22. They want to appear tough on corruption, and they want to discourage autocracy. But at the same time, they realize that their aid programs are responsible for getting, to some extent, food to kids at schools, and HIV drugs to people who are infected with the virus. And so even though those programs have tons of problems, they probably do some good. And so they feel kind of torn. And that's perfectly understandable. But I think we're entering a new era where we have, thanks to the private sector, we have really expansive telecommunications in Africa. There are obviously some gaps, but Malawi is a country that's densely populated and has great cell phone coverage for its income level. And we can get money around bureaucrats and get it to people and programs. And so I think this we're sort of at a unique moment where we can use our technology to both help people and place a lot of pressure on regimes that are not interested in reforming.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And something I wanted to dive further into with Village X is since that's been put into place and you've been kind of spearheading that, what kind of progress has been made in Malawi, and what different projects have successfully been carried out in the past few years?
Yeah, we've done, I'm trying to think of how many projects now, probably like 35 or 40 projects.
Wow.
In 14 villages, roughly. We have about 14 villages that we work in, and then we have, probably twice as many or 3 times as many control villages, and where we haven't done anything. And it's really, we fund whatever they want.
Right.
So we've done, about half of our projects have been water projects. The first thing villages want is clean water. And from there, they like choosing nursery schools, teacher houses. Nursery schools are great because they provide early education, and also, parents of kids can be more productive in agriculture or in a small business if their kids are away from them for half a day in the morning. Just like we use daycare in this country. Teacher houses, a lot of rural communities have trouble attracting teachers. So if they can build a teacher house next to their primary school or secondary school, they're much more likely to get another teacher. Education, I think, is widely recognized. There's huge, it's widely recognized as a way to catapult someone out of poverty.
Right.
And so there's a lot of emphasis placed on it, even though the educational offerings or standards are pretty low at this point. What else do we do? We've done, villages love goat projects because goats are what's the word? They are assets that grow over time. They appreciate. You can. They're all female goats, and you can find male goats, and you breed them, and then the whole village benefits from the goat production. Goats are enormously stabilizing. They're very hardy. They rarely die. They're not as like chickens require a lot more upkeep. And what we found is that goats lead to more girls in school, which is something. What we're trying to tease out relationships that have sort of been hidden, and so that's one of them. One thing I want to point out is we're not a girls' education NGO. We're not a water NGO. You could call us a democracy NGO. I think that's fair. But what's interesting is that we have better impacts than most single issue NGOs, and we're not focusing on a single issue.
Right.
The only area where we've really not seen any improvement is agriculture. Villages need fertilizer.
Mm-hmm.
They have decent seed already, but they need annual deliveries of fertilizer, and they just fertilizer makes a huge difference, and they don't have it. So what we're thinking about doing, we did three sort of fertilizer experiments, where we villages chose fertilizer, and this was not this past growing season, but the previous one, so 2 years ago. And the villages that got the fertilizer did far better agriculturally than the rest of our treatment and control villages. But the problem is, if you say to a village, you can have anything you want, one project per year, you just have to put your own money in. We require 5%, so it's $100 for a typical $2,000 project, or $300 for a $6,000 water project. If you tell them that, they'll say, "We want fertilizer every single time," because that's something they really worry about. That's the lifeblood of the community. They need to be able to feed themselves. So what we're thinking about doing is launching an agriculture program, where we raise a seed loan of $2,000 for every partner village, and then charge whatever the inflation rate plus 10% or something. So it'll probably be like 20% interest or 15% interest, and then we basically it's a revolving loan. So we wouldn't be paying back donors. It wouldn't be an investment for donors, but the village would pay back the principal every year with interest. They would get the fertilizer they need, and then we would roll the loan over to the next year. So it would have a perpetual, fund for fertilizer. It's about kind of hitting all of these areas at once, but in a sequence chosen by the village, not by the outsider. Mm. And in terms of impacts, we just got some new impact data for 2017. I'm just going to read this off of the document I have here, if I can find it. So we saw, this is from 2014 to 2017. So in 2014, we didn't do anything in any villages. That was our baseline year. And then we did projects in 15, 16, and 17.
Okay.
And we saw 84% increases in boys in nursery school, 109% increases in girls in nursery school, 63% increases in girls in secondary school or high school, 77% increases in goats, 68% reduction in waterborne illness, 123% increase in non-agricultural businesses, a 62% increase in homes with metal roofs, and a 138% increase in what we call the overall development score. So we combine all these data points together into an overall score to see, just get a general idea of where the villages are. And Malawi's had a tough few years, so all of our control villages have been tanking in development score, and all of our partner villages have been rising in development score. So we think we're having a huge impact. The entire program cost $7,000 per village over 3 years, or $2,300 per year per village on average. And as I said earlier, that was about $1.08 per person per year. Hmm. So, and we didn't have the funding. We've raised about $120,000 for projects. We didn't have the funding to do one project in every village every year.
Right.
So we'd probably want to spend a little bit more, maybe 3,000 per village per year on average, but it's still a very small amount.
Yeah, sure. How would you choose which villages to be control villages? What was the methodology behind that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. If we were doing it perfectly, we would have randomized.
Right.
We didn't randomize. We basically have a pool of villages that want to work with us. We have way more villages that want to work with us than we have funds.
Sure. And
so we kind of started off just with a group of villages. We have a cluster sort of a cluster in Malanje district, and a cluster in Zomba district, and in Palombe district. And so we just kind of spread out across districts and chose little clusters. The villages aren't so close together that they would necessarily the effects would spill over from one village to another. But and then we just had around those villages, we had villages asking us, the treatment villages, we had villages asking us for the same help, and we used them as control villages. And then eventually the idea is that will become treatment villages. We collected this data to hopefully generate interest in what we're doing, and then we need to scale up to about 300 villages, get enough funding for 300 villages. And then if we get to that level, there are academic researchers that want to do an RCT on our model. And they can find the funding to do it. So we're, I would love for someone to run an RCT on this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe there's someone I can find you to get in touch with. My development economics professor, he wrote the textbook for that. He does a lot of randomized control trials. He's done a lot of work, I think, in Uganda recently, and then in Bangladesh and Southeast Asia. But he really focuses on agriculture and on rural farmers, and he sees that's where we need the most development. Who needs the most help is rural farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, and then also.
What does he think of 1 acre fund? Do you know?
I don't know. I'd have to ask him. Yeah, it's been a while since I talked to him. I was in his class last semester in the fall, but I definitely want to get back in touch with him. I think he's actually he might be in Uganda right now, but he's done a lot of randomized control trials. I remember reading about that. But I mean, yeah, that was his big thing that he emphasized was the agriculture element. But
yeah, I mean that's typically that's like the well-worn development path.
Right.
You have a lot of, in these countries, you have a lot of labor, low-skilled labor is the way economists look at it. Sure. Yeah. And you have a lot of land, a lot of arable land in Africa. And so with the right, and unlike much of Asia and Europe, where you had landholders that were basically, you had tenant farmers and landholders that were major concentrations of power, and you had to engage in land reform to take their land away and give it to individual families. In Africa, I mean, that's often a very bloody process. In Africa, that's already mostly taken care of. Most of the land is in the hands of smallholder farmers.
Right.
So you don't have to do land reform, or at least not that much of it. And you have a lot of low-skilled labor that it's abundant. And you have a huge population boom, right, coming. So Africa is, it's growing tremendously, and a lot of the people alive in Africa are very young. So if you can get the right inputs, you can get the agricultural markets to work well, and you can get the right inputs in. At the same time, if you can reform agricultural policy so that when farmers see huge gains in production, they can then offload some of that excess production and make money. So it's a combination of get farmers to grow more,
right,
and then which involves fixing input markets, which are hard to fix, not because there's something wrong with Africa, but because politics that are screwed up, right? All this basically comes back to bad politics.
Sure.
Bad politics leads to bad markets, oftentimes.
Yeah.
And so if you get the input markets improved, and then people grow more food, and then you get the export markets in shape, so that, like in Malawi, for example, the government doesn't allow anyone to export maize. So if Tanzania has a drought and needs a bunch of maize and is willing to pay a lot of money for it, Malawian farmers are screwed unless they go to the black market and they export across the border secretly. And that's a real shame. And I think if you dug into it, what you'd find is that there are certain Malawian power holders that don't want that. They don't want to open up the markets for export. They want to. There's some way in which they're benefiting from the status quo, and so it all. I mean, it's not hard to. These people work very hard. They're good farmers. They're limited in terms of technologies they can use, which is a problem. And in Malawi, they only have one growing season, which is an issue. And it's almost all rain fed. So they have very little control over whether it's going to be a good year or a bad year. But they're not the problem.
Yeah, of course.
The problem is that they're not getting the inputs they need. Yeah. And then when they grow the excess food, they're not getting it to the markets that want to absorb it.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to wonder is like, how do we bridge the divide between the first world and the third world, where, I mean, you're doing the data, you're doing the research about things that will be more effective than other aid, and it's like, how can you communicate to that people in the first world, where I feel like they're so bombarded, like it's such a saturated market what nonprofits have become. And it's part of the reason why I got into effective altruism, actually, and I just liked that they had some PhD economists who, like you, would do the data, and would just say, look, this is a lot more effective than that, and we have all this evidence. Doing these evidence-based approaches, how can we make, I guess, nonprofits that do evidence-driven stuff stand out from other nonprofits?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is really discouraging. I want to read the book you recommended about the psychology of giving. Yeah. I haven't read that. Absolutely. I think what you'll find is that nonprofits in our country do a very good job of kind of like satisfying that need, whatever it is that, people are getting most of the benefit of giving in the moment of giving. They get a endorphin rush. Sure. And they feel very good about themselves. And so most nonprofits, particularly sophisticated ones, even ones with horrible track records like the Red Cross, they just, they basically, they're like any other business. They manipulate as best they can to get what they want. And so if you look at the nonprofit world today, it's just really highly marketing oriented, not results oriented. The other thing is that if you're really being honest with people who donate, you have to say, like, this is really hard stuff. So every dollar is not going to be used perfectly. There will be, problems. There are delays. There are, all sorts of things that affect how effectively your dollar actually helps someone. But I do applaud the work of the effective altruists. I think that they're bringing new rigor to the field. I think where they stumble is that they still are kind of stuck in the technocratic mindset. Right. If they can just figure out the most, like, the intervention that provides the biggest impact per dollar, let's say it's putting chlorine dispensers at boreholes, right? Okay. Yeah. Let's just say they figure, or it's deworming or whatever. Yeah. Figure out this is the thing that causes the biggest impact per dollar. Right. And if we just do this, here's the formula. Like, I'm the PhD economist. I've given you the formula that you have to, apply. What they haven't addressed at all, which worries me, or very little, is that they're not changing anything about the politics. They're not changing. They're not focusing on the politics of the aid industry, and they're not focusing on the politics of the countries in which they work. And so, they're deworming some kids, and they're showing that that's a really good investment per dollar spent. But I think that those gains will be ephemeral if they don't also figure out the politics. And what they tend to do is just partner with existing NGOs that are in these countries, and like the World Visions of the world, and the CARES and the Concerned Internationals, and these big mega million NGOs that are themselves huge concentrations of power, and who themselves perpetuate the poverty dynamic that we're trying to fix. And so you have to do more than just, figure out, the best intervention per dollar spent. You've got to look at the political dynamics. And you also have to look at, this is another thing RCTs are not great at. Mm-hmm. They can be designed to get at this, but many of them have not been. And that is how all these things interact together.
Right.
So it's not just about deworming pills. It's about deworming pills plus clean water plus education for girls plus this and that. So you want to look at how these things all interact together, which requires a lot of different treatment groups, right. Which means a massive number because you have to look at all these combinations. So it's a massive number of villages or individuals participating in your study. So I've been told that there's more work going in that direction of right. Looking at the interactions. But I think that's certainly needed. That in combination with some really serious political analysis,
right?
Not just tapping into the status quo and saying, because all they're doing is they're saying we need to deworm kids, and then they're saying, okay, World Vision, here's $5 million, go right. Deworm some kids. It's no, you've got to figure out a way to disrupt World Vision. That's what you should be disrupting.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think part of the problem also is just how homogeneous the community is. So I remember I had gone to giving what we can. You make a pledge, and you look at everyone who's done the pledge, and it's a lot of quantitatively minded people. So I think they need to recruit more qualitatively minded people, and a lot of people in effective altruism come from Ivy League schools, and I think they really need to branch out from that. And it'd be great to start having these conversations between PhD economists and PhD political scientists and then people who've been in Peace Corps and seen it firsthand, and get all of those perspectives together. And then you can create a more holistic solution, like you were mentioning. I mean, I still think it's a good step for the effective altruism, but I'm hoping this is just the preliminary stages. I hope it continues to evolve, But you definitely need many perspectives on this. It's complicated.
And you also, the other key is you need many perspectives, but you also have to look at where the money's going.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So if the American donor that really does want to make a difference actually looked at where money was going, I think they'd be appalled.
Yeah.
There are a lot of studies have shown that 15 to 20% of your dollar actually reaches the project.
Right.
And a lot of the times the project is crap to begin with. And a lot of money gets spent on salaries, plane tickets, SUVs, fuel, workshops, all this stuff that is virtually meaningless. So I think a lot of it is also money is power. This is why cash transfers to poor people work so well, I think, because it imbues them with both choice and with power at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. On the subject of cash transfers, I just wanted to say, when I was at DW, I saw this conference by the chief economist of USAID, and it was such a great presentation because she pretty much said, here's all these projects we try to do in sub-Saharan Africa to help with job training, to help with higher education, things like that. And she said, this one failed, this one failed, this one failed, this one failed. And they used as a gold standard just giving cash. And if your intervention that you offer at the USAID is not better than giving cash, then we'll scrap it. I think that's a great idea, but also shows how great cash transfers are too.
Right, but then get her to tell you the truth, which is that USAID would be really effective in many ways if it would do that.
Right,
but it's hamstrung politically by Congress, and it will. If you look at, it's still funding the same stupid projects that it's always funded.
Right.
It does more cash transfer work, but if you look at the overall percentage of aid programming that's cash transfer oriented, it's still a very small percentage.
Yeah, and so maybe the big problem there is it's just such a large organization. There's
well, I think it's I think it's a combination of bureaucrats that want to not rock the boat too much,
right,
and Congress people who are really clueless about development, and also you have to bear in mind that development is not. They should take the word development out of USAID's title because they're not interested. Really, what aid does is diplomacy. If you look at the State Department, basically uses aid as a diplomatic tool, and so any project, they're very unlikely to do anything subversive. They're very unlikely to challenge the Malawian government. They're very unlikely to, stir the pot a bit. Instead, they kind of just like do the same old thing they've always been doing. They make sure that everything is, kosher with Malawian elites, and they fund a bunch of academic researchers to do studies and write reports that a few people read, and over time, nothing really significant changes. There have been some, there's some desire to like, empower, through like incubators and funding startups, try to figure out new solutions to ending poverty, blah 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 blah. There's been Raj Shah did some interesting stuff like the development innovation.
Mm-hmm.
Was it Development Innovation Labs or Ventures? I think Ventures, DIV. But for the most part, even the most sort of well-intentioned person at USAID who wants to see, extreme poverty plummet in Malawi, is kind of stuck.
Right.
Like their whole financing mechanism is slow. It's cumbersome. It's not nimble. They know that the programs they fund are not terribly effective, and they're constantly fighting for their budget and their jobs. They don't want any major controversies. They don't, aid is a political football, and oftentimes it's the members of Congress on the left and the right who fight over it don't even understand it. And so it's just kind of a mess.
Sure.
It's like a terrible combination of incentives if you actually care about development. If you care about leveraging development money to get to achieve your diplomatic goals, it makes much more sense.
Yeah. So I guess for our listeners, those who want to get into the world of development and helping people and charity and things like that, what would you recommend they do? What would be some good, steps to take?
Well, one thing to do is just pick a place, right? I know a tremendous amount about one country,
right,
from top to bottom. I mean, I've been all over and met people at all sorts of levels. I really, feel like I understand how it works better than most outsiders. And one problem with our current system is that people don't specialize. They just kind of bounce around. Well, I'm going to do a project in Bangladesh, so they're going to fly me over, which is going to cost a lot of money, and I'm going to stay in a hotel, which is going to cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about Bangladesh, but I'm going to, gather some data and write a report. That makes absolutely no sense. Yeah. That's a recipe for failure. So I'd say, like, even though the system wants you to do that, if you really care about development, what you should do is learn a place really well. Learn the language, live in that place for an extended period of time. Don't live with a bunch of other, foreigners like yourself.
Yeah, no.
Like, just get out there, actually experience the country. It's almost never done. The only people who do it are really Peace Corps volunteers.
Right.
So that's one piece of advice. Second piece of advice is, gain some quantitative skills.
Right.
It's astounding to me how many people work in development and don't understand how statistics work.
Yeah.
We need data-driven policymaking domestically and internationally. So, like, data are not perfect. I don't want to oversell data, but we've been flying blind mostly for the last 50 years. And based on stories, narratives, anecdotes, that's just not going to cut it.
Right.
So I'd say focus on a particular country, get some quantitative skills, and then network like crazy. I think it's a really odd industry. In fact, I would say you might do more good by not going into it and by going into another field,
right,
that will make your brain look at the world a different way, and then working on development as like a side project.
Right.
It's a brutal field. It's very hard to break in. When you do break in, you break in with organizations that aren't doing much good. You might, if you're lucky, pursue a job at one of the startups that are doing interesting things like Give Directly. Trying to think of, there's so few that are really exciting, but Give Directly is certainly one.
Yeah.
1 Acre Fund, I think, has some potential, and not, I think that they're legit in terms of being open-minded and self-critical and really smart.
Yeah.
I don't think they have the perfect model, but I think they're worth looking at. And just maybe look for, if you want to work full-time in the industry, look for a disruptive way in. And then if you, if you really want to succeed, hold on one sec. I just have to help my wife buckle something. Oh, for this up. Okay. There you go. Okay. Learn a place really well, quant, and then look for a startup or some kind of upstart disruptive organization to work for, instead of these old dinosaur World Bank, USAID places where you're just going to or a USAID contractor. I mean, you're just going to kind of wither away and wonder why you even got into it. Because a lot of people who are in these jobs, they're in it for the right reasons. They really want to help people. But they find that once they're in, they're not getting paid a lot of money. But once they're in, they're like, this is how things operate. This is a mess.
Yeah.
Right. And also think very critically about what you add. There's so many people in development who want to just do good in the world. But if they stop and they ask themselves, I'm getting paid $60,000 in Washington, D.C. Am I adding multiples of that value to the industry, or am I really adding value, or am I just plugging into a system that's broken? And I think most of the time people are plugging into a system that's broken. And so just be self-aware about what you're actually adding. If you're not adding value, go find something else to do.
Yeah.
Don't, I mean, it's a system that it's basically a hiring program for the West.
Right.
It always has been. It's a diplomatic tool. It's not really designed to maximize development gains or help people. And it has been designed, and it currently is operated to help as many Americans and Western Europeans as possible. It's fun to live in Malawi and send your kids to private school and get, Skippy peanut butter delivered to you, through the diplomatic pouch. Right. And, drive around in this poverty-ridden country living like a king and taking your kids to swimming pools. But there's something sort of deeply morally troubling and ethically troubling about doing that. If you actually want to change things, then do something disruptive.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I just wanted to add, with what you're saying with working in a startup, I think that's so essential, because I think the skills you'll learn on that is much, deeper, even more comprehensive than if you're just doing one job in a larger organization, especially when you're younger. It's so important coming out of college just to build skills, not just, it's one thing to have ideas, but if you can actually do something and create value. And the statistic piece is huge. I feel like part of the problem is, like, in college, I remember I took a statistics class, and most people were just so bored, so I'm like, maybe statistics needs to be taught in a more interesting way. I don't know. I mean, it's obviously dry, but maybe they could use applications being like, okay, now here's how statistics is used in the real world, instead of just telling you what standard deviation is or whatever, maybe that would be interesting, because I agree. I mean, it's incredibly important.
Yeah, I think, the sort of the foundation of statistical analysis is the central limit theorem.
Right. Yeah.
And that is, if you understand that, like, pretty much got it. And it's a crazy, trippy, revelation, right? That like, you take the average of something, you take a bunch of samples of something and you take the average, and the distribution is always normal distribution. Right. Of anything in the world. That's crazy. That's insane. I mean, you really stop and think about that. That's such a beautiful thing. And it allows us to make these statistical predictions, which, we're not really saying that. I'm not telling you that, we have an 84% increase in boys in nursery school with 100% certainty. Right. I'm telling you that I think it's like p-value is it's less than 1%. So I'm 99 point something certain.
Right. Never
that's
100% certain, but it's pretty close. Yeah, that's good.
But it's pretty cool. I mean, it's we live in a probabilistic world.
Right.
And so I think that's, I mean, it's not like, it is conceptually tough at times, but well worth doing. And it at least puts us at it creates some sort of standard by which we can judge our programming and the programming of others. And, until recently, most nonprofit work and much government work overseas was just sort of based on guesswork.
Yeah.
It wasn't based on anything solid. I will say, like I'm really quite critical of the development industry. And if you talk to people who work in the industry, they're also quite critical of it. I don't think that I'm saying anything new. They just don't want to go on the record.
Yeah, you're on. Mike Buckler's on the record.
Mike Buckler's on the record because Mike Buckler's friends are the ones who are living, much who are encountering much unnecessary suffering, human suffering, and living in villages.
Right.
And where and Mike Buckler knows that for a relatively small amount of money per village, you can significantly improve the situation for people, both developmentally and politically. So I've always definitely had a bit of a chip on my shoulder and been a bit pissed off just about the power imbalance and how frustrating it is when people are just clearly getting screwed. And we're the greatest democracy in the world. We should be setting an example of, we're all about disrupting bad politics. That's what we do. That's what we encourage. That's what we promote, supposedly. But in development and in some of the other things we do overseas, we're very much autocratic, and that worries me. We shouldn't be that way. So that's a bad example. But I will say that although I'm pretty down on the industry, there are some people doing really interesting things within it, and I'm very optimistic about the trajectory of humanity. And also I'm very optimistic about the potential for aid.
Right.
Like if we actually got people who control the purse strings to make the investments that we know would lead to better politics and better development, we would see amazing results. So I'm really only frustrated about the politics of aid, not the people, not the potential, just the politics.
And something I'm curious about is what are your future plans for the Village X and looking forward? Do you have any vision and goals and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I think what we'd like to do is kind of grow organically, more users, more fundraising campaigns, support more villages in our program, and reach out now that we have another year of good data. We did our first data analysis last year. Now we have even stronger data this year.
Awesome.
Reach out to some of the major foundations or maybe Silicon Valley folks who are interested in what we're doing, and just try to grow to the point where we can support 300 villages or get the funding commitment to support 300 villages, and then get academics to do an RCT on the model and see what's actually going on. I think if we had strong RCT results, we could then take the next step. So it's kind of like, we're sort of at the tail end of what would I call our pilot phase, where we're just trying to see, like, logistically, can we do this? Can we take money from the U.S.? Can we get it to villages in Malawi? When they do get it, what do they do with it? Does it help?
Right.
How much does it help per dollar spent? Can we develop a network of field officers and train them adequately so they can carry out this program, which is very light oversight. We like to call it cash in, data out. But our field officers are points of contact on the ground. Can we? And we've answered a lot of those questions. So I feel like we're sort of at this moment where we want to steadily grow our budget and maybe quickly grow a budget, depending on how much interest we can generate. Get to 300 villages, do an RCT, and then take the next step from there. But as you alluded to, there's a lot of competition in the nonprofit world. There's been a proliferation of nonprofits over the last 20 years. A lot of people are giving locally. It's very kind of a nativist climate right now, and so I think we're also aware of the risks. And with my current job, which I really enjoy, it allowed me to kind of take my foot off the accelerator a little bit and let VillageX breathe and grow organically.
Nice.
But so I don't know. I think ideally this would scale into post RCT, would scale into a nationwide program in Malawi. So in 10 years, if we could have an annual budget of $10 or $20 million, and we were, in all of the extreme poverty villages in Malawi, it's a 10. What we do is our current plan is a 10-year program. So one cash transfer per year for 10 years. We don't want it to be a perpetual thing. So I think that's the idea, is like see what the first 10 years looks like, and then expand into other countries. So we get 400 million people who could benefit from this program. Chiefs and villages are kind of chiefs are seen as important leaders and respected leaders in many of the least developed countries in Africa. So I think it's a program that can expand Mozambique and Tanzania and DRC and up across the continent into all the Ethiopia, all the extreme poverty areas. So.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I think I'll end there, but no, I thank you, Mike Buckler, for coming in and talking about all this amazing stuff. I mean, I know I learned a lot. I'm sure my listeners did too, but I mean, this is incredibly important. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.